Hello, and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we shake, or today stir, a cocktail or other mixed drinks, perhaps some variants as well. We take a sip, see how they are. We're continuing our quest to work through the IBA's list of official cocktails and see how those stack up and look into their history a bit. We're still in section 1, that's the unforgettables, and this week's unforgettable is the Martinez. Now, the Martinez, which also is sometimes called the Martinez, is an interesting drink. I wouldn't call it forgotten. It certainly shows up still in a lot of sources. However, it doesn't really exist clearly. And what I mean by that is this drink's generally sourced as the predecessor of the martini. And it might be, but if you've seen our martini episode, you know that there's a ton of stories behind where the martini came from and all the different names it had at the beginning, and none of them really make sense. The Martinez story is actually the one I sort of went into in that episode about a town in California where it was supposedly created, but then it turns out that that bar wasn't in that town, and the guy who supposedly was at the bar didn't exist, and the guy who was telling the story would have been like 2 when it happened and didn't make any sense. So we have no idea where this came from. And so it's not entirely clear if this is a predecessor to a martini or if this was just another name for sort of a proto-martini at the same time. There's also a very similar drink at the time called the Turf Club that's happening on the East Coast at this time. It's all very confusing. One of the earliest sources we have for it that it clearly has something called a Martinez cocktail is 1884. There's a book by a gentleman named Byron, and he lists it after the Manhattans and says same as the Manhattan but substitute gin. Now that's not an incredibly helpful description because he lists 2 different Manhattans, one of which uses dry vermouth and one which uses sweet vermouth. Also, he just says gin, and so in 1884, whether that's Old Tom or whether that is Ginevra is not entirely clear. A lot of folks argue that it would have been Ginevra, Holland's gin, Genever. That's possible. We know that on the Manhattan, that was common at the time still for some people to substitute that for whiskey. And of course, those spirits are fairly similar in a way that Old Tom gin or dry gin is not. So maybe that's all that sub meant, in which case really it was just a very clear Manhattan variant, or maybe it really was a different drink and that's the predecessor to the martini in some way. It's honestly entirely unclear. What is clear is that this is a drink featuring gin and sweet vermouth, mainly. And as Manhattans at the time, which we didn't go into in great depth in the Manhattan episode, I don't believe, but in Manhattans at the time, it was common to add a little bit of gum syrup, a little bit of curacao, a little bit of maraschino, or one of those, 2 of those, it just depended. So in this drink, there is often a bit of, depending on who you ask, either maraschino or curacao, and some early sources say to add some simple syrup or gum syrup, though writers even as far back as 1892 complained about that, saying that is just too much sweetness for this drink. So we're not going to do that, but we are going to do some of the other additions. The IBA's version uses some maraschino, for example, so we'll do that. We're going to look at 3 different variants today. One's going to follow the IBA. IBA's version uses London dry gin, which is certainly not correct to the time period. So that one is very much a modern riff. Then we're going to look at 2 older versions. One that I think is going to be fairly accurate to what you'd see in a 1880s spec Martinez, assuming that was really a thing, and the other being a little bit later, sort of just pre-prohibition variant, which again actually has a really questionable history, so may or may not really be related to the Martinez in any way. So not great history on this one for me to give you, unfortunately, but I think we're going to get some great drinks out of it. So without further ado, let's start with the IBA Spec. Alright, for the IBA Spec, we are going to start with 2 dashes of orange bitters. I'm using Regan's, but feel free to use whatever you have handy. Then we want 45 milliliters, that's about 1.5 ounces of a sweet vermouth. I'm going to go ahead and use the Antica formula. That is obviously very popular and hip these days. Feels like that fits into an IBA drink. And we want a same proportion, 45 milliliters or 1.5 ounces of a dry gin. going for Tanqueray. And then we want 1 bar spoon of maraschino liqueur. And let's give that a stir. And I'm going to strain that into a ideally chilled Nick and Nora glass here. I believe it just says small cocktail glass in the IBA. So use what you like. And then for a garnish, we want just a small twist of lemon. And the IBA doesn't express it, they just put it onto the drink, but I'm gonna go ahead and get the oil out first, and then they like it on the rim, like so. And that is an IBA Spec Martinez. So first thing I would say is definitely express the lemon. That just really aromatic right at the beginning of the palate. And on the nose. Drink itself is good. It's very, very mellow, right? Tanqueray is fairly assertive gin, but really with the sweetness of the maraschino and the fact that Antica formula is pretty vanilla-y, pretty heavy, it's really not poking through with the juniper. It doesn't feel incredibly proofy. It feels very smooth. We get the rich vanilla out of the Antica, some red fruits there. I get the hit of lemon on the tongue. I don't really get enough of the orange bitters. I'd like to have more of that happening. Let's just go a little bit more of those. Yeah, so that helps. I think it's expecting a more assertive orange bitters that has a stronger base to it. With the Regans, you need maybe a hair more. Delicious drink, just really smooth, just straight down the line. I think this would be a great drink for someone who is not a gin person, maybe. Good starting point because it's not incredibly junipery, incredibly gin forward. Really nice drink, nothing incredibly special, but be happy to finish that. All right, for variant 2, we are gonna look to the variant in Jerry Thomas's classic Bon Vivant's Companion. It's in the 1887 edition, which if you are familiar with the different editions at all, you know that everything in the 1887 edition gets shaken because whoever edited it, which was not Jerry Thomas at that point, just loves shaking things. We're not gonna do that. We're gonna stick with stirring because that just makes so much more sense. And let's go ahead and make that one up. So here, I'm gonna start with Angostura bitters. It calls for Boker's bitters, and I know that nowadays there is a recreation sort of available, I believe. I don't remember who did it. I do not have it, so Angostura bitters always work fine in anything that calls for any of those weird old bitters pretty much. So just 1 dash of that, and then we want a little bit of maraschino. It calls for a couple dashes of maraschino. I don't have a dasher bottle, so I'm gonna be just careful on this one and get a partial bar spoon. And then on this one, we are gonna flip the script on the vermouth to gin. So in some early versions of the Manhattan, as well as early versions of the Martinez, there is more vermouth than there is gin. And this goes back in our Manhattan episode. I talked about whether the Manhattan comes from strengthening a vermouth cocktail or weakening a whiskey cocktail. Well, this is kind of the other side of that question. So I'm gonna use Dolon Rouge here. I don't want the vanilla and sort of age vibe of Antica to totally drown this out. So we're gonna use about 2 ounces, that's 60 milliliters of Dolon Rouge. And then for the gin, we're going to use the period correct Old Tom. Again, there's some question whether Hollands was meant in some recipes. In this recipe, it is specifically asked for Old Tom, and in some others of the time as well. And I think that makes more sense here. I am of the belief that Hollands would have been sort of a call on a Manhattan rather than a drink of its own. We just need 1 ounce, 30 milliliters. And then we're gonna go ahead and give that a stir. And we're gonna go ahead and strain that into a ideally chilled coupe. And I'm using the coupe here even though the wash line is much lower, because the garnish for this is putting a quarter of a lemon slice, which is a weird measurement of a lemon slice, into the drink itself. So I don't really know what a quarter of a lemon slice is. I'm gonna say, and I know that they did not have lemons this size in 1887, so I'm gonna say this is at least a quarter of a lemon slice. So we're just gonna plop that right in there. This is very close to, minus the bitters substitution, in 1887, Jerry Thomas, by which I mean whoever edited Jerry Thomas, a Martinez. Ooh, so that's a cool drink. I like that. The Dolon obviously is a lot more mild than the Antica, so even though there's more of it, I'm not just getting that vanilla bomb. The Old Tom is also not assertive, but of course it is quite a bit sweeter, and in a nice way. It's sweet in a bright way rather than a really like heavy, sugar-rich way. So that actually plays really well with the vermouth. The Angostura bitters stand up better than the orange bitters did. I like that. It's a little bit lighter, a little more mild than the last one. But it really pops. It tastes incredibly fresh and bright. Really good. I like that drink quite a bit. And for our final drink today, we're gonna make the 4th degree. Now, is the 4th degree a variant of the Martinez? I have no idea. I've seen a couple different write-ups of where this drink came from, and it's not that common of a drink anyway. It is in the Martinez section in David Wondrich's Imbibe, so that's where I thought of it from, and it is definitely connected. It seems like this is probably a fairly common way to make a Martinez and or a martini in certain places in the pre-Prohibition days. So the drink write-up we're working from in Wondrich is from a 1931 book about the Waldorf Hotel and the cocktail scene there. So that is sort of right there, the pre-Prohibition recipe. And this is interesting, and the reason I chose it is because we haven't gotten to yet talk about Plymouth Gin. We've talked about Holland's Gin, of course, very similar to sort of whiskey. It's a aged spirit, dark color, some barrel notes, very malty. Then we get into Old Toms, which have more of the botanical character, but are a little bit sweet, a little bit bright, whatnot. And then, of course, in modern day, the most common are London Dries, which these do go back a long time, but they were not common in the US until the turn of the 20th century. These are going to be not very sweet and tend to be very juniper forward. Plymouth goes back into the 18th century. It is going to be closest to a London Dry, but it's going to be a little bit softer, a little bit less dry, and less junipery. The botanical mixture is different and includes more earthy things, slightly bitter things, less juniper. And so this was a very common spirit around the turn of the century in the US. This is the only company who still makes it. This used to be a whole class of gins. Now there's just Blackfriars Distillery. And the fun little note there, if this is captured in the cameras, there's a monk on the back of the bottle. He's called the Thirsty Monk. And when his feet are no longer dry, it means you need more Plymouth Gin. Anyway, on the back here, it says, documented at the turn of the century as the gin used in the Marguerite cocktail, the original dry martini. Now, we talked about the Marguerite in the martini episode as well. That story's bonkers. There is tell of a cocktail called the Marguerite, but the whole history of that one and why it's named that and stuff is just even more bonkers. So it felt fitting to bring that into this Martinez martini story. So let's make this one up. This one's gonna be very simple. For this one, we need 1 ounce of our sweet Italian vermouth. which again, I say Italian meaning sweet red vermouth. Dolent, of course, is French. We want 2 ounces of our Plymouth gin. That's 60 milliliters for all of you in metric science land. And then we need 1 dash or 2 dashes of absinthe. I do not keep absinthe in a dasher, so we're just going to do a little finger drop. That is plenty enough. And this is Pacifique from a suburb of Seattle here. And that's all we need. We're going to give that a little stir. And this one we're going to go back to our preferably chilled Nick and Nora glass. Really nice pale color on that. I kind of like that. Kind of a rich straw, if you will. And then we're going to try to get, there's no garnish specified in the original version of the drink, but we are going to try to get some lemon here off my mangled lemon. That was fairly successful. And then I just like it right in there. And this is a version of a 4th degree. I didn't even mention a lot of versions of the 4th degree and a lot of versions of the Martinez do a dry vermouth, sweet vermouth mixture. I do not prefer it that way, so I did not. So this is by far the most assertive version. Obviously, having the gin 2-to-1 over the vermouth. That little bit of anise from the absinthe. This one's a much harder hitting drink, which I think, again, this makes sense to me as coming into the 20s, what you might see developing as the dry martini's also developing. You might see this coming along. It's really nice. The gin is there, but again, it's not super juniper forward. It's providing the alcoholic backbone of the drink. It's giving you a little bit of a punch. You're getting some of those slightly bitter, slightly earthy botanicals. The Dolent is just really providing sweetness and kind of, there's some botanical there, but it's just keeping everything from getting incredibly dry and harsh on the palate. Keeps it smooth. You get that little bit of anise at the end in the back of your throat from the absinthe. Really nice drink. All right, thanks so much for coming along with me today on this Martinez adventure. Sorry we didn't have slightly more accurate histories and versions of this one, but this drink, just in my mind, it isn't really a thing. It's just a name that gets applied to some things. So that's what we did today. If you liked it, or if you at least got through it without being too upset, I'd appreciate all those YouTube things, liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting, ringing bells. All of these things are greatly appreciated. You can check out the blog, shakingandsipping.com. You'll have a write-up on this and each other drink, as well as most weeks we'll visit a local cocktail bar and have a write-up the following day on how they make the drink. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that this week because this drink I don't think exists. So I don't know if we're going to do it. We might. If so, it'll be up on the blog tomorrow. You can follow me on Twitter at shaking_sipping, where you'll find out for sure if we're doing a blog post tomorrow, as well as other sort of Twitter updates. We'll see you next week with the next drink on the IBA's list of official cocktails. And until then, happy sipping. Cheers.